I was told to tell you that please switch off those mobile devices that you're not using, because we have some limitations in bandwidth. So if you have several mobile devices with which you can access the internet via our Wi-Fi system, switch off those ones you don't use. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this session on hateful speech and how we can address the phenomenon. I have been asked why we chose the term hateful speech over the term hate speech, which is a little bit more common and, in my opinion, also overused. And despite this term of hate speech frequently featuring in legal settings, in laws and regulations, but also in commercial terms of service agreements, there is no universally accepted definition of hate speech in international law. In the ICCPR, however, the states who subscribe to the ICCPR, they are obliged to prohibit incitement to violence and incitement to discrimination and incitement to hostility. On the other side, in national legislation, but also in civic discourse, there seems not to be a clear way to distinguish this such speech that incites from speech that merely criticizes or insults or offends. And there's only very few pieces of legislation that refer to a threshold or multi-part test when assessing the potential of harmful speech inciting to violence or hostility. And in fact, the term hate speech is now today used to describe a wide range of verbal and non-verbal and artistic expressions which might be insulting, which might be intimidating, harassing, abusive, or just critical, but also to refer to speech that actually has the potential to trigger violence. And this is where the problem starts, and this is what we want to discuss today. Because what might be insulting and offending to some is very much tolerable to others. So we're talking about a very subjective notion here, which very much depends on the cultural, the social, and political context it is expressed in. And this is also why the term is easily abused, as we know, but especially by those who want to silence critical speech, dissent, satire, or irony. And although I have said this, I think that all of us, at some time, we feel that there is a limit to how far someone can go. It's just very difficult for us to see how to define that limit, to define this limit, or to actually describe what criteria we should use to define it. And also, there's a question: who should set the limit and who should define these criteria? What is acceptable and what is not? And how should this decision be made? And last but not least, is it useful at all to have some common understanding of what should be banned and what not, and what should be tolerated or not? Within the OEC context, we have two major decisions. One is a Ministerial Council decision of 2004, and this decision asks the Office of the Representative, and I'm quoting now, to assume an early warning function when laws or other measures prohibiting speech which is motivated by racist and xenophobic or anti-Semitic bias are enforced in a discriminatory or selective manner for political purposes, which can lead to impeding the expression of alternative opinions and views. In other words, the representative is tasked to react when participating states are abusing hate speech legislation to silence criticism. This is from 2004. Also from 2004 is a Permanent Council decision which asks the participating states to fight intolerance and hate speech, and also ensure that the internet remains an open and public forum for freedom of expression. So you see, the OEC as such is tasked with these very different objectives which the participating states want to achieve. How to reconcile all these objections? Yeah. We know we still have to reach a balance, in particular as to the online sphere. There are major disagreements as to whether or what kind of content to regulate. We have seen this in the previous three sessions. So I hope that over the next 1.5 hours we can discuss some of these questions, but also critically look into the effectiveness of legislation that was passed to fight the dissemination of hateful online content. Because this is something we are not very clear how effective this legislation is and what the negative impact it has or will have. We also need to look at the proportionality principle. What is the effect hate speech legislation has on the free flow of information? And have these laws in any way tackled the root of the problem of hateful speech and actually led to a decrease of hateful speech in the online sphere? With this I stop, and before we move to the panelists to hear their views, I'd like to ask Peter Molnar, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Central European University in Budapest, who has just published a publication on the content and the context of hate speech. And with that publication, which is here, and you have some flyers out there which describes the content of this, Peter and his colleagues tried to look into whether and how it is possible to tailor hate speech policies. And they looked into histories and different value settings and cultural settings. So when he distributes it, maybe we get a short overview of the making and the content of the publication. Peter, the floor is yours.
And all others at the Media Freedom Representative's Office for organizing this really nice and important opportunity to talk about this issue. And so this book is and I asked to pass around the 2 display copies we have so you can look at it and you can look at the flyers which also list the chapters. So this book is a sort of, as the program called, a special study which I hope will help us to rethink regulation and responses to so-called hate speech, and I hope it will be very helpful. As you can see, 26 chapters are in the book, among others by Miklós Haraszti, the former media freedom representative of OSCE, who wrote one of the prefaces, and Andrei Richter, the current director of the office, wrote a very nice chapter. Tarlak McGonigal, who's in the room, also wrote a very nice chapter. And actually, Dunja Mijatovic also participated at one of the starting conferences of the project at the Central European University. So her thoughts and energy, in a way, also made the book richer. And so the book has been trying to create a dialogue, and I ask all of you and encourage all of you to engage in that dialogue between what can be described as the 2 main schools of thought to deal with this problem. And one school can be described by as content-based, which is saying let's ban so-called hate speech based on its content. And the other school can be described as context-based, which says that it's too dangerous to authorize those states to regulate speech based on its content, so let's restrict speech in case of even such ugly and dangerous speech only when we don't have time to respond, so when there is imminent danger of violent action, or then, of course, we can add discriminatory action as well. That's up to discussion. So those are the 2 schools of thought, often expressed as beliefs without much of effort to try to understand the other side, without much of dialogue. So the book tried to present both kind of argument in conversation with each other. One example, an exchange between Jeremy Waldron and Ronald Dworkin, but also some interview chapters are reflecting on each other. And so we hope that this way the book will help rethink responses and regulations. And as part of this quick introduction, I would like to suggest to think in really specific terms on this subject, because I think usually what happens that even at expert conferences, often we are speaking in very broad terms. Last time at the conference I heard someone saying, so hate speech and incitement to violence, two very different things, and the person didn't try to define neither of those. So if we go like that, we will not go anywhere. So I suggest that we need to be really specific, and I would like to ask, if I can, if you don't mind, everyone who will participate in the debate, this debate now, will be very specific. If you suggest something, try to provide a definition. If you suggest a policy, let us know how you think that will work. And so my own proposal, along with some other authors in the book, that we should keep the, so for content that we find ugly, that we find, because it's hateful against whatever groups, we should focus on educational responses, including artistic responses, because that's the way we need to deal with content. Instead of authorizing our states to say, oh, that content is so bad. Because, of course, then all sorts of arbitrary, abusive judgments can be made on content. And when I say this, it's very important to specify that, and it's also in the book, that then I talk about speech in the public discourse. So I don't argue for that there cannot be specific regulation which can be characterized as content-based regulation, for example, at workplaces. One chapter by Arthur Jacobson and Bernhard Schlink, as another example of a cross-Atlantic effort, describes how such regulations are applied at workplaces in the United States as a way of regulating such speech. And it doesn't bump into the famous First Amendment, and I think it rightly doesn't bump into it. So I talk about, when I say education and art, including art, should be the main response, of course that's a response to so-called hate speech at workplaces elsewhere and other special environments, but I think that especially that should be the response and no regulation in public discourse in general. Again, that doesn't mean that, for example, media-specific regulations of radio and television as push media cannot be justified. I cannot really go into details. I just sketch the picture now, and then we can talk details about these things later. So now I continue that when it comes to regulation of such speech in public discourse, I think instead of the content-based approach, we should focus on the context. And that's what seems to be the decisive thing, because in certain inflammatory context, even a less ugly, less inciting hateful speech can create imminent danger of violence, but in many environments, even the most ugly and most inciting speech cannot create such danger. So we should regulate, we should ban the first thing, when the context is so. It's one of the features they attach to this concept, that's intent, because usually that's a free speech safeguard, that we cannot restrict the speaker or punish the speaker except if the speaker wanted to incite intentionally hatred, and that resulted in imminent danger, if we go by the danger test. I argue myself, and Nadine, as a free speech advocate, longtime president of the American Civil Liberties Union, which famously stood for the free speech rights of neo-Nazis as well in the US, agreed that less than intent is enough. There might be situations, again, context is the main thing, where a speaker, in a way, should realize that if she or he expresses incitement to hatred, that would result in like such an inflammatory impact that restriction of speech there is justifiable. And I conclude with bringing it to the internet, and also as an example, again, how specific I suggest we need to be when defining the elements of a potential definition or description of how the restriction on such speech can be built on. It's that when internet carries incitement to hatred, earlier it was not accessible some years ago, let's say on the spot, where extreme right-wing neo-Nazis were rallying around the houses of, say, Roma Hungarians in Hungary. There was some time between a neo-Nazi looked at the inciting content and when he or she showed up at the demonstration which potentially was imminently dangerous to lives of people. These days, through iPhones, more and more, on the spot of such an event, an inflammatory environment, people can access the inciting content on the internet. What we can see here, there is a change in technology, development in communication devices, they become more, internet access becomes more mobile, and that results in higher probability of inciting speech to result in imminent danger. And we need to see that. And that's the level of specificity we have to see it, because this way the internet can come closer to what the infamous radio station in Rwanda could do, that the radio was, of course, a mobile communication device. So wherever people were going around looking for people to kill, they just had the medium with that, which gave them information and incited them to take action, violent action. With the mobile communication devices, the internet can do similarly. So as you see, when I argue for, and I close with that, when I argue and others in the book argue for a context-based approach or an imminent danger-based approach, I don't argue for not limiting some speech. Actually, I argue that realizing the impact of mobile communication devices that can provide special access on the spot everywhere, more and more everywhere to the internet, can justify more regulation based on context than earlier. What I argue for, that let's go with that context-based approach instead of the at least much more potentially arbitrarily used content-based approach. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think this is a very, very interesting publication you have here, and very important to differentiate between the content and context, and always look at the content in the context it was expressed. I would somewhat caution against arguing that the likelihood of harm increases with the wider dissemination. I think there's more to look at in this respect. But let me, with this, move to Guy Berger, who is the Director of Freedom of Expression and Media Development at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris. Guy is from South Africa and was once a political prisoner there, where hate legislation was passed under apartheid to make criticism of white domination illegal. And as a journalism professor, I learned that he supervised research into the complexities of online moderation of reader comments concerning xenophobia, and he will talk later about this, right? And I hope also, you told me that you will not just differentiate between content and context, but also introduce the notion of proportionality and power, which very much has to do with the role of the speaker, I assume, right? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zenet, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm now working for UNESCO as Director for Freedom of Expression, and I think what's important about this context now is that we're not in the 1930s of Nazism and that kind of hate speech, but we're in a situation globally where the biggest problem is not the abuse of free speech for hate speech, but rather the lack of free speech. And so from a UNESCO point of view, we would far rather stress the need to open up speech rather than to limit speech, particularly because, as was mentioned, the more you introduce limitations under one pretext, they very soon mission creep into other areas, whereby you kill one cancer, i.e. hate speech, but you end up killing a lot of healthy cells in the same process. And I think also we're in a context now where the multiplicity of speech today means that we need to begin to make more of a distinction than has been made previously between speech and acts, so that when people go and attack on the basis of seeing a certain video on YouTube which denigrates Islam, do we blame the video or do we blame the people who are doing the attacks? This becomes a far more important distinction nowadays when there's so much speech, to take, I think, more emphasis on the acts rather than on the speech. Of course, when one's talking about organized hate groups, that becomes a different thing, just in the sense that, in campaigns against crime, the thing is not for individuals who go through a red light in the middle of the night. It's against organized crime groups. But of course, when we're talking about this hate speech, we're talking about limiting, of course, the organized groups. But what about the milieu of popular prejudice? What does one do about that? This is the kind of ocean in which these hate speech, organized hate speech groups work. And I think if we see this thing from that perspective, it's less about the dignity of some individuals who are offended or upset or insulted by hate speech, but it's about the social phenomenon and about the norms. So I would draw your attention in this regard that in France there was an anti-Semitic tweet called Un bon juif, which means a good Jew, which then was circulating. People said a good Jew is a dead Jew, a good Jew is belongs in the concentration camps and so on. This became the third most popular hashtag in France for a certain period. And in Mexico, there was another tweet with a hashtag which said, I'm trying to remember, I burn like a Jew. Okay, and this became the sixth most popular hashtag in Mexico. So here you're talking about very, very widespread popular prejudice, which, to my mind, you can't deal with by sending everybody who tweets or retweets to prison, even if it's offensive and even if it meets the hate speech things. You're talking about a milieu which doesn't necessarily convert into action, but is a milieu which is, of course, useful for organized groups to work on. But I think that's where one comes to the question of, well, what do governments do? What's the responsibility of governments in response to this? Well, if you can't take legal action because it's just impractical, of course you can take legal action when that turns into action itself, into direct attacks. But you need to address this, and I think the only way the governments can really address it is by really promoting information and media literacy in the schools, which of course they have the power to do and are not doing nearly enough. Then you come to the other sphere of society, which is really what do non-state actors do about this kind of thing. And I very quickly will mention this research that I did with a student of mine in South Africa. And this is about the media. And of course, from a UNESCO point of view, we want to say free media, but of course, we'd like to encourage the media to use that freedom for peaceful purposes. Now, in South Africa, this example I'm going to give you was in 2008, there was a lot of xenophobic violence by South Africans against mainly other black Africans. And 62 people were killed and 30,000 people were displaced. So on the web, this is some of the statements that were made. People commented on the articles and they said, the poorest of the poor are taking a stand against the influx of illegal foreigners. It's the right thing to do. Somebody else said, listen to what we're telling you, get out. We don't need 15 million foreigners. I'm not sure where the figure comes from, but I'm just reporting this to you. It says, the illegals must go or they won't receive decent burials. It's a shame that those attacking the foreigners must resort to violence and illegal means, but a man fights for his rights with the weapon he has. These liberals who are complaining don't have to share their lives with, don't have to share their living area, their women, their houses and their water supply with foreigners. And in one case it said the foreigners are here to cause trouble, they should get beaten up. So this is comments reflecting a certain segment of public opinion that was on the internet in South Africa, on media websites. Now the interesting thing is that the particular website that these comments came up on was a very liberal newspaper, a very campaigning, investigative, progressive, pro-human rights newspaper. And yet you have these comments which, as I've outlined, they clearly violate people's rights to dignity, even to safety, because it amounts to direct incitement. So what kind of limitation then is appropriate for a newspaper in this position? Because do you ban it, or do you tolerate, or do you challenge it? So when we researched why the newspaper, this progressive newspaper, had all this poisonous stuff on its website, what they said to us was that basically two reasons. One is they have very small staff. They don't have a big team, and it takes a lot of time to moderate all this content. In other words, it's not practical for them to ban everything. And they said that they also decided to let some comments pass because they knew other commentators would engage, and that ultimately the majority sentiment would be against this. Now, against this view, some people said they should have restricted this content, and they're based on principles. They said that even one abusive comment makes a mockery of the policies and the law and human rights. And they said if you suppress these comments, it wouldn't have harmed free speech. But those people who are against restriction, they came with a pragmatic kind of contextual-based thing. They said, actually, this kind of speech wasn't causing the violence. It was legitimizing it, but it wasn't causing it. And second of all, the people making these comments weren't the ones who were actually committing the violence, because the ones committing the violence don't have access to the internet. It was poor people who were committing this violence. So this raises, and I'll end up now, this raises very interesting questions about what should have been the responsibility of this newspaper as a medium in civil society which is faced with its own constraints but needs to intervene some way to deal with the norms of this thing. Well, perhaps they could have toned down certain sort of problematic parts by editing them. But at the same time, I think in a way they decided that they had to tolerate this because they're now in an age where it's different. In the old days, hate speech could be controlled in the media because the media had a monopoly on the content. Objectionable voices had nowhere else to go. Now, if you control it, they'll go somewhere else. So do keep them in there. Content didn't come in a torrent, in a flood in the old days. Now it's coming in a flood. So I think they decided rather keep it there and try and challenge it. So, the answer to Ned's question, ban, tolerate, or challenge, it was kind of challenging. And I think this becomes an interesting question then, because if we regard hate speech as based on prejudice which is irrational, well, of course, rational for some reasons, but basically it's not scientific to say all Jews are like this, or all blacks are like this, or all Roma people are like that. One of the key things the media can do is actually debunk this, to show that this is a fantasy, to present a view which shows that it's not only illegitimate, it's not scientific, it's not accurate to come up with such generalized responses that tend to be the basis of hate speech. So I think in terms of upholding the norms, international norms, I don't mean the popular prejudice norms, I think the media's got a huge role to play, and I think governments have got a huge role to play, as I've said. But I think these are not banning responses, because banning responses in this day and age are not really practical. Where they become practical or become urgent is when speech turns into action. But other than that, they have to be dealt with in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. I think what you just said is very important to emphasize that legislation that legislates restricts certain type of speech is a very easy solution and very comfortable for all of us who, societies as such, they tend to outsource the solution of their problems, and challenging hate speech or hateful speech is definitely for many of us probably a lot more difficult than just relying on the legislator to solve the problem and get it off the net or off the newspapers. We'll speak about media education and media literacy and other methods to address hate speech other than by legislation and laws after the presentation of Nico van Eyck. he has to leave a little earlier today, so I'll ask him to talk now. Nico is professor of media and telecommunications law at the University of Amsterdam. He's also chairman of the Dutch Federation for Media and Communications Law and a member of the supervisory board of the Dutch Public Broadcasting Organization. Nico wants to talk a little bit about the Wilders case and the very important difference between defamation of religion and defamation of individuals. Nico?
Thank you. And I'll try to keep it short. It was on the 27th of March 2008 that a 16-minute video appeared on a website called Live Leak, so-called Fitna movie made by Geert Wilders, as you probably all know, an extreme right-wing politician, highly debated, highly provocative. The video showed one of the Westergaard cartoons, the famous Danish cartoons, and while also showing images from recent events like 9/11, Madrid, London. Texts of the Quran were linked to those images. Newspaper articles from Dutch newspapers about the Islam and conflicts surrounding people participating in either religious or other events were showed, and at the end there was an image of the Quran, and you heard the sound of ripping a page. It was actually in the movie itself that it was explained that it was not actually the ripping of the Quran, but it was ripping a page out of a telephone book. Probably if it would have been a Quran, then we would not have had any discussion about the distinction between acts and speech. But it was clearly done to provoke, but to avoid a too drastic confrontation. That was also what Wilders himself claimed, that the whole film was there to have further debate about the position of Islam in the Dutch society. Of course, the question then came up what to do with that. And to simplify a little bit the story, the public prosecutor didn't want to prosecute the case. There is a special procedure from the Dutch courts that then allows the courts to be asked to oblige the public prosecutor to start a case. That was done in this case, and so we had a court case where the public prosecutor was actually asking for an acquittal on all accounts. And that was finally also the decision by the court. And the main argument was the fact that Wilders was not into either hate speech or incitement to hatred towards the believers of the Islam, but he was only attacking the Islam as such. You can imagine that this did lead to quite some discussion, and it's still something that's highly debated, certainly amongst academics. But the case also shows that courts and public prosecutors are not easily inclined to act upon crimes or the provisions in the penal code on incitement to hatred. It also shows that maybe, at least that was my conclusion, that the juridification of hate speech and incitement to hatred is a very, very difficult one. And we can indeed really question whether courts are the right place to find solutions for these kind of problems. Also, the juridification that took place with so much detail is, of course, of an enormous academic interest, but it also creates a kind of chilling effect, because you really need to be a lawyer to understand where the boundaries are. Maybe you could argue that being a responsible person, you have your own morals and ethics, and they are enough to define something like the boundaries of what is allowed and what isn't allowed. But then again, when it turns into this borderline where you have to find, is this what we really want to deal with under penal law, or we should not deal with, there, I think, before you know, it was mentioned in the previous presentation, before you know, the solution is worse than the disease. And I think the Wilders case is a perfect example, because the court case, on the one hand, some people said, well, he got acquitted, therefore it clearly shows you can get away with whatever you want in the Netherlands. Other people, I think, and I belong to that group, say, no, we did have a lot of awareness being created through this case, and sometimes time is a better solution. And as you know, during the last election, the political party of Geert Wilders lost a substantial amount of votes in Parliament, and therefore has much lesser seats than they had. And I'm hoping for a next election soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. I think it's important to stress that if hateful speech is in fact challenged, it has a big potential of reducing the reputation of those ones expressing it, and that shouldn't be forgotten here. Let me move to Helena Mandic, here to my left. Helena is the Director of Broadcasting of the Communications Regulatory Agency in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She was involved in drafting the press code of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as laws on defamation and freedom of information and communication laws. As you might know, Bosnia and Herzegovina is one of the countries in the Balkans where the press is not as professional as they could be, and sometimes it's even, I mean, at least to me, physically painful to read the newspapers. But at the same time, it is just, I think, a reflection of the society. Media reflects the society, and information on the internet reflects political discourse. So the causes of this unprofessional journalistic activities, I think, much deeper rooted than many politicians say or would like it to be. And Helena will talk a little bit about the need for in-depth and proper education.
Thank you, Janet. Well, I think that we all can easily agree that the education is the key point, and really it's not just about media literacy programs and similar programs, but the education in general. And let me just talk a bit about how we started. We were one of the first regulators in the region to be established in 1998, and since the beginning, and one of the reasons that we were established actually was abundance of hate speech in the country. And as some of my colleagues who used to work with me and who are here with us in the room, as they remember, the first code of practice was really very, very basic. It had, I think, 4 or 5 articles. One of them was dealing with hate speech, obviously, and it was very basic. It was regulating is incitement to ethnic and religious hatred. I'm proud to say that we developed a definition a bit. It's a bit longer now, but we're really trying to make it as specific as possible, so it covers issues like incitement to violence or discrimination on any basis, and also speech that carries a clear and immediate risk of inciting ethnic or religious hatred, or which could be interpreted by the public as incitement to violence, disorder, or rioting, or which could lead to or encourage criminal activities. So we really try to cover many, many areas without going into vague definition of what hate speech in now we're talking about audiovisual media services, because we moved on obviously from the traditional broadcasting, and this definition applies to both linear and non-linear services, because hate speech is something that has to be regulated also on non-linear services. So in retrospect, when I remember the cases that we were dealing with back when we were established, sometimes I think that some of the decisions seen now might be interpreted as a bit too harsh, maybe, but it was due to the very specific circumstances that we had in the country right after the war. So we are talking about the situation just 2 or 3 years after the end of armed conflict, where people are still physically divided in the country. So through our work and also work on some other institutions, we managed to even say at some point, I remember one of my senior colleagues saying quite victoriously, you know, okay, we rooted out the hate speech. Little did we know at the time that it's impossible to root it out completely. The enemy is just regrouping, it's mutating like a virus and taking different shapes and forms to come back and hit us with even more force. And really now what we have in the country, and it applies to, I'm afraid, to all media, print, electronic, internet, all types of media, is this enemy in new shapes and forms, as I said, and that's my main source of concern. I mean, they grown so much, these people, you know, they're making such good things now. I mean, they shape hate speech. They mask it into documentaries. They mask it into debate programs, where there is absolutely nothing, not one word that you can pinpoint as that would fall under this definition. But you know that the entire essence, the entire purpose of the program is to deepen the ethnic tensions in the country. And that's it. I mean, there is no regulatory, there is no legal response to such issues. The only thing that we can do, and that we are trying to do, not only the Communications Regulatory Agency, but also the Press Council, the Association of Journalists, etc., is to raise public awareness. We're trying to organize public debates, to kind of to warn about the dangers of events, of cases like this. So what we did a couple of years ago was we organized, with help of Internews agency in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we organized a series of roundtable discussions on hate speech, what hate speech is and what hate speech isn't. Because in Bosnia you will have some speech which might be, as Janet mentioned it also in introductory notes, it can be defamatory, it can be lacking any taste, it can be sometimes insulting, but it's not hate speech. These cases are being proclaimed and defined as hate speech directed against entire people, even in cases when such speech is directed toward one political leader, for example. I mean, if you're questioning his or her doings, then all of a sudden they go like, oh, this is hate speech against the Serbs, Bosniak, Croats, whichever applies, and because they think that they represent the entire ethnicity. So what we try to do with this series of roundtable discussions was to try to make this difference between hate speech and non-hate speech visible. And what happened? It was only us, you know, at those roundtable discussions. I mean, the speakers and some journalists. And there was absolutely nobody, and we sent loads of invitations. We sent invitations to people that we know disagree with us, because we wanted to open a public debate. We wanted to talk about these issues. Absolutely nobody turned out at these events, and that was really discouraging. So and the final point is the one that I mentioned in the beginning, actually, the need to educate people. So it's obviously we have to introduce media literacy programs, but if the education system in general is not changed, and I know for a fact that in Bosnia and Herzegovina and countries in the region, and I know also that some other European countries and OSCE countries definitely are struggling with the same problem. I mean, the children are taught to memorize things and then just to reproduce them. There is absolutely no critical thinking. There is no questioning of what the teacher are saying. There is no debates in the classroom. If we don't have that, if we don't foster this kind of critical thinking among young people, then of course, I mean, it will be even more and more difficult to organize any kind of public debate and to raise awareness about the dangers of hate speech.
Thank you, Helena. I think it clearly shows that if this speech is not challenged at the right moment by the right people, it has great potential of affecting the society as a whole, and how then to find a way out of these institutionalized stereotypes that, you know, no one remembers anymore where they came from and how they were established. Before I move to Floriane Hohenberg, I think it's a lot of us in this room. We didn't expect so many at the sessions, and it's getting a bit stuffy. I don't want you to faint. Do you think we can open the window for like 5 minutes? Yes. Shandor and Tarlach, maybe you move. I don't want you to get a cold. Yeah. And shout if it gets too cold, yeah? So, Floriane Hohenberg, she is the head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, with its seat in Warsaw. That's one of the 3 independent institutions of the OSCE. And at ODIHR, Floriane works a lot on media education, or education as such, to fight tolerance and discrimination. So maybe we hear not to fight tolerance, to fight discriminations, to fight intolerance, hopefully, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. Our mandate at ODIHR is really to help governments to uphold their promises when it comes to combating intolerance, discrimination, and to promote mutual respect and understanding. So we look at the issue of hate speech and hateful speech from a slightly different perspective, but I think that is complementary and something that Elena has just mentioned. We look less at the speech or the author of the speech and its intent and rather at the impact it has on individuals, on affected communities, and as a consequence on society at large. And we try actually to alleviate the impact that it can have and to prevent speech from happening. So we don't look at all at establishing the fine line between what is permissible and not permissible, because it's really not our role. But we think rather that every hateful speech is really something that is not really acceptable and that should be countered in a way or another. So we have educational programs to look at this. we work in schools, and we guide educators on how, for example, to counter intolerance and discrimination against different groups, Muslims, for example, against Jews. And this includes really something that Elena mentioned, literacy, human rights education, the ability to think in a critical way, but also in a very concrete way, the ability to be able to address stereotypes and prejudice, things that have been passed on in families for centuries, because we think that hateful speech is somewhere rooted in something like this, in wisdoms, wrong wisdoms about some groups, about some people. And we think it needs to be addressed from the very, very youngest age, by the teachers, by the students themselves, by the system as a whole. And the system as a whole has to be able to create a space for students that is safe, so that they can feel that they are not left alone if hateful speech occurrences take place. So these programs that we are offering and guidelines we are offering are very comprehensive. We are talking about a comprehensive approach to school, and we have developed guidelines together with UNESCO and with the Council of Europe on this issue. We also have developed very concrete teaching materials on how to address anti-Semitism in the classroom. And it really goes from really deconstructing the narratives, century-old narratives about anti-Semitism over the history of Jews, to really discussing contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. So this is for the education part. What we want to do is countering this narrative and empowering those who are the victims of speech to be able to respond, to feel really empowered, to feel supported by their peers, to be able to respond to that. We think that there will never be a way to eliminate completely hateful speech. We just need to be, all of us, weaponed, let's say, equipped to respond to it. Another area of work we have is we work a lot with law enforcement. We are a security organization, and we have a very strong mandate when it comes to combating hate crimes. So there is a connection.
Wider dissemination, so the often mentioned fact that the internet makes it possible to disseminate so-called hate speech as well as any other content more easily, more quickly and globally, that should justify or could justify more restriction. What I was saying that the accessibility, the more and more mobile accessibility of all content, including incitement to hatred, might justify in certain situations restriction that would not be justifiable if such content could be accessed only in certain distance, both in space and time, from the inflammatory situation, let's say, where neo-Nazis are rallying around houses of Roma people. So that's what I was saying, that how the access to internet becomes more mobile through iPhones and other instruments. It's the internet devices are becoming more likely to contribute in already inflammatory situations with a certain content to imminent danger. And that, I think, what we have to keep in mind when we decide whether restriction is justifiable or not. And just a quick response to the questions about national context like Pakistan or how Facebook deals with these issues. The way those of us in the book who argue for what I call a context-based approach argue is that, of course, as again Nadine Strossen calls it in the book, it's a context-specific functional limitation. And functionality here means that we say that all states should intervene and say it's beyond freedom of speech, not because we think that, oh, that content is so outrageously hateful. That's not the reason. If in this room someone would be outrageously hateful, wouldn't create imminent danger, we would just ask her or him to leave. And but it's a context-specific functional limitation, and of course, it depends on the context. So if the context is unstable or inflammatory in certain ways, then in that context, some more restrictions can be justified than it would be the case in a more stable environment. And for Facebook, that of course poses a question that Facebook deals with issues everywhere, and I was at a conference recently with one of their leading policymakers, and I know that they are working on this to somehow develop both the transparency of their policies, which is kind of a notice and take down policy, and I am sympathetic to their approach that somehow they try to apply at least relatively narrow understanding what they call so-called hate speech, and then take that down based on reports. But I think for them it's also a challenge whether it's justifiable and useful to take down stuff that does not create danger. If it does not create danger, why don't we just respond to it? And we know the problem. It's like if in our body there would be some sickness. Wouldn't we want to know about it to see how can we deal with it? We would.
Okay, and then there was the question to Helena about Talak's comment and also the impact of the international community. Yeah.
Well, after this as you well put it, deflating experience with these public debates, what we continue to do is to really use each and every opportunity to point out what the differences are, and you know, what isn't hate speech, and to try to, from our end, to raise awareness. And there is currently, and especially like if we have a complaint, if we have an ongoing case at the agency, all of our decisions are well reasoned. I mean, we never close the case, or we never issue a sanction with just, you know, basic explanation. I mean, we really write pages and pages trying to convey our message. So that's as much as we can do, because our position is very much in danger now in Bosnia, and that also comes as part of a response to your question, because after the war, the international community, I mean, probably many of you know that Bosnia is not normally a functioning country. I mean, when the war was over, we had this Office of the High Representative who had the supreme power to do anything and everything in the country, to impose laws, to ban people from offices, to ban them from any public functions. And in the beginning, those powers were used extensively, and as a result of one of these powers, there was an inception of the Independent Media Commission at the time that was predecessor of the current Communications Regulatory Agency. Communications Regulatory Agency was also imposed by the High Representative, who decided that the competencies of the IMC and the telecom regulator should be merged. And that wasn't, at the time, in 2001 in Bosnia, it wasn't because of the convergence of technologies and everything. It was an attempt to help telecom regulator to get out of these heavy political influence that they were under. So in those years after the war, the international community did a whole lot in order to improve the media situation in the country in its entirety. So there was Independent Media Commission. There were defamation laws were adopted, freedom of information laws were adopted, communications law, obviously, and so the entire framework was there, you know. And for a couple of years, it really functioned well. But then in 2004, some political tensions started to rise again. And in 2006, there was an attempt to make some constitutional changes that failed utterly. And ever since, the situation in the country is really worsening on a daily basis. And sometimes I think that the international community was surprised to see how things can deteriorate so fastly, really. They were like taken by total surprise, like, is this possible? But then also, I mean, when our independence was first being endangered 5 years ago, we were crying out loud. We were trying to get them to do something. But I mean, at that point, it was really almost a unison response by the all major international players. Okay, so we helped you to get out of the war. We built the system in the beginning. Now it's up to you. And they're very much silent on these issues. I mean, you will always have regularly press releases, statements that really media freedoms should be upheld. The independence of the regulators cannot be undermined. But in real life, there is absolutely no action.
Thank you, Helena. I think we should be distinguished here also between the international community playing a role in strengthening existing institutions to address the problem, and versus the international community trying to address the problem itself, which would also, in my view, be a way of outsourcing the solving of the problem. I mean, you cannot have a third party coming into a country and fighting a very national or cultural problem, at least not as long as it's on a certain level. Of course, if it escalates, there's a different issue, but that's not what we're discussing here. Divina wanted to take the floor, and then I would say we take another round of 3-4 questions, and we close.
Yes, just to answer the 2 questions on the EU and the Innocence of Muslims video. The EU is a very interesting case of what I was talking about, the problem. Thank you, Tarlak. Because we've been a lot of experts pushing for that law, and it passed in a weird way since it was made possible by the directive on media and communication services. So it was allowed to us, as we, as Europeans, liberalize as much as possible our media. And at the moment, media education comes through a wave of liberalization, which is not necessarily democratization. I insist on that. And what is happening is that it's a kind of neoliberal approach that is provided, in the sense that it's supposed to be the answer to deregulation. So we are deregulating massively, therefore people have to regulate themselves. Education, as it is seen in the directive for media services, not goods, services, paid for, understand, is basically you young people and adults, you should learn how to regulate yourself. It's not even the state. So at the moment, there's a huge risk that media education be used for privatizing education and privatizing risk. Oh, your freedom of expression has been attacked. It's your problem. You should have known. There's no need for the state to protect, to establish laws, etc. That is the message if we're not careful. If a state doesn't put any resources, and I'm taking the case of France, in France we don't have resources for media education. At most, there's 6 hours of training per year for young teachers. So what is happening? Private companies are coming into the schools and offering their services. And the public schools in France, and there's only that almost, pay for media education services and teaching. And the big catalog owners, Lagardère, Canal+, etc., are selling us their catalogs, because we have no exception to IP rights for education. Okay? And I wonder if you have similar cases in your country. But at the moment, though everybody says that's the solution, great, we have a window of opportunity, and this is what we believe too, and those who are pushing for it, the implementation level is a privatization level. And it's a risk to public access to information and to knowledge. So that's a problem, because the EU is the legal arm of Europe. So UNESCO, Council of Europe, we are in a position of advising, providing guidelines, soft, etc. But the EU is the legal arm.
Thank
so
you,
please
Davina.
mobilize. Just one thing about the innocence of Muslims. It's a perfect case study for hate speech and literacy. Because, of course, different countries reacted differently, and we saw that if you remove something, it produces glamour for that thing. I don't know if you've looked at the document, that document. It's shit. I mean, let's not put another around their cultural common heritage. And you get these kids and their parents to come together regularly to produce stories about statues from the 12th century. That works.
So Guy also wanted to reply to Wolfgang's question on this example, the cultural context, when to block, when not to block, why in one country, not in the other country, and how companies actually decide that, or not.
Yes, which also takes forward what Davina just said. Somebody asked Google, why did you do what you decided to do? And they said, well, we blocked in Egypt because of the danger there. And an activist from Pakistan said, why didn't you block in Pakistan? But a Tunisian regulator who was there in this discussion said, who on earth do you think you are, Google, making decisions about what is imminent danger in our country? We are mature enough as Tunisians. We will make these kind of decisions. So this illustrates, I think, the complexity of this. But at the end of the day, if you have more and more international content that can be exploited in certain contexts, the only way I can really see going forward is to separate the acts and the speech. Because ultimately it's those who use the speech for acts of criminality who have to be the most culpable.
Are there any other questions? Like, should we take two or something? There's one here, and someone else still? Then that would be the last.
Thank you. It's just, I suppose, a very short reflection in the shape of a question. Gavin Titley, National University of Ireland. There's a kind of an assumption in the discussion that hate speech is emotional, prejudiced, irrational, and that it can be corrected by rational engagement, disproving, and that the mainstream media versus the wilds of social media plays a particular role in this. I just want to give an illustrative example. In November, a True Finns politician in the Finnish parliament quoted statistics that were statistics purporting to show that there was a disproportionate percentage of rapes committed by immigrants in Oslo vis-à-vis the native population. That fact has been circulating in the kind of far-right Islamophobic networks for a decade or two. Those networks themselves have undergone a way of thinking about their language and thinking about their discourse in the last 20 years to move away from overt, racially hierarchical hate speech to presenting themselves as scholars, as a counter-public sphere that's being ignored by the mainstream. So you get this fact turning up in Finnish parliamentary debate, and not a single journalist picks up on the fact that this has been generated in and amplified in and through the internet. Yet it has, of course, a hate effect of a certain kind. So my question is, why do we always think that hate is somehow irrational and prejudiced, when if we look at it as ideological, and if we look at how ideology is communicated, it opens up another set of debates? And why do we assume in a convergent media environment, where fact-checking and verification and user-generated content are integrated into mainstream media flow, that journalists can play this kind of rational gatekeeping role that we associate with previous media models?
Just very quick, I'm glad you bring it up, because also, for example, in my country, both the extreme right-wing party and the big right-wing government is using so-called hate speech in a politically very beneficial way. I'm not mentioning it in order to go to politics, but one can observe that. So the division of labor is like extreme right, and I think it's typical in other countries as well. And that extreme right-wing parties might say some overt hateful stuff, and then there is coded speech. And coded speech not necessarily tied to right-wing. I mean, one can imagine other kind of coded incitement to hate. It can be class-based, of course, as well. But so I think, and it can be cold-blooded calculation, how that will bring votes. So, and that is also why I think it's important to see that regulation is just not only content-based regulation is not only often useless, but it's an ersatz displacement which drive our attention away from the real issues, and it can cause damage. It can hide reality from us, while reality, the existence of really extremist forces, while it cannot catch coded speech, which of course doesn't provide that the issue is easy. It's very hard. It seems so-called hate speech is unfortunately a very human thing. We must face it. But that's why we must be very, very cautious and clever how to deal with it.
Yeah, I think your point is very relevant, because what I said before was that media, to a certain extent, is just a reflection of the political discourse. And I think it takes a very healthy economic and social environment for media to be able to report independently, which is not the case everywhere, of course. And the worse the economic situation gets, the less the media is able to do this. So this would actually open this debate, you know, to other aspects, such as financing of media and economic situation and advertising and everything. But Helena also wanted, yeah.
Your question just actually made me think that I missed one very important thing to say, that in Bosnia, the media are not really generators of hate speech. It's politicians. It's politicians. So, I mean, rarely, in my practice, I have rarely seen cases of irrational hate speech. It has, in most cases, been a part of very deliberate campaign. And there we face a totally different problem, lack of reaction from institutions like prosecutors, you know, because, I mean, hate speech is not defined as we define it in our code of practice for AVMS, but it exists in criminal code, like incitement to ethnic and religious hatred among the communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there is absolutely no reaction by the prosecutors. There was one case where association of journalists actually filed a official complaint to the prosecutors, and they keep, you know, prolonging the investigations for months and months, hoping that everybody will just forget about it. So that's the problem that we are facing.
Yeah, just in response to your point, I have a hunch, which is that to the extent that media deals in ideology, it's still news media. I mean, it deals in the ideology of realism. So, you know, I mean, the news media is not pornography. You know, people know pornography is a fantasy because the news media is not confirming what happens in pornography. And I think that news media's business model is to keep its credibility as being kind of realistic. And that's different to social media. And I'm not sure to what extent the more social media grows, the less its credibility grows. Because what's trending now will change. And, you know, it's kind of like a real passing parade of opinion and myth and kind of facts that you were referring to. And I think that for media, the news media to survive, it's really got to differentiate itself from that. To say, we are in the business of realism. And this is what the world's like. These stereotypes are not real. I mean, either they say it deliberately, or in effect they say it because they're presenting accounts of reality that don't match with the kind of hate speech stereotypes. So I'm not so pessimistic, put it that way.
I think you can continue during the coffee break. If I had to now sum up, you know, what kind of different ways there are to address this phenomenon, I would say that the the preferred and first option should always be education and awareness raising. The earlier the education happens, the better. And regulation of hateful speech should only happen as a last resort and only after applying a multi-part test, namely looking into in which context was the content disseminated, what kind of content is it, who was the speaker, like what is the power behind the speaker, the position, the authority, what was there an intent. And I think the internet comes in here under the rubric of intent. That's how I would see it. Was it expressed in a public or in private sphere, the frequency? So I think the problem is very complex, and the ways to address this might be even more complex. And maybe for us as the OEC, we take back that at the next time when we discuss this issue, we might look into very concrete examples, education examples, how to address this problem. I would personally have liked to see that. Maybe this is something I take back to my office. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the speakers very much, and all of you for holding out in this stuffy room. So enjoy your coffee break. Excuse me, can I just ask you, Peter circulated 2 of his books. Bring it back to them. Thank you.